Earlier, my colleague Elaine Reyes spoke to a professor at Harvard University. Yascha Mounk is also the author of a New York Times article called "Is Harvard Unfair to Asian Students?"
So do you think the students suing Harvard, the Chinese students, have a valid point? And do you think their lawsuit will go anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with these situations is that it's always very difficult about any one individual to say whether they should have been admitted, because it's so complicated to decide what makes for a Harvard student. But certainly when you look at the aggregate evidence at a statistical level, it's just very clear that discrimination is going on. You know, one of the really striking facts is that in those few years where Harvard admitted more Asian Americans, the year after that, suddenly they admitted record lows. So I think what's going on is that the admissions office has a kind of idea of what a perfectly diverse, balanced campus looks like, and that includes that there has to be a number of people who play football, and a number of people who play the violin, and somebody who, you know, does cross-country, but also that it can't be too many people from one ethnicity. That if Harvard was suddenly 50% Asian American, it wouldn't really be our Harvard anymore. And that's a very pernicious thought, I think.
What do you think needs to happen, though, to change the system? Should race be taken out of the admissions process entirely?
Yeah, so I think, you know, the debate in America is always about affirmative action. And I think that we can bracket that question out. It's an important question, it's a complicated question. I'm happy to talk about it in a moment. But the first thing to note is that Asian American students are being discriminated against compared to white students, right? So to get admission to elite colleges, Asian Americans need SAT scores that are about 140 points higher than white students. Now, whatever you think about affirmative action, whether you're in favor of it or against it, that is clearly unjust, and there's no justification for that.
Test scores, you know, people could say, well, if you take away race, maybe you should take away, or not weigh test scores as heavily as, say, other attributes that a student brings to the table, their community service, their activities.
Right, so test scores are only one thing that goes into Harvard admissions. And the dean of Harvard admissions, William Fitzsimmons, claims that one of the reasons why Asian Americans are being admitted in lower numbers is that they're less interesting, essentially, that they have less high extracurricular achievements. I want to say two things about that. The first is, according to academic studies, that just isn't the case. So we don't have a study of Harvard, but we do have a study of 100,000 applicants to UCLA, and it shows that there's absolutely no correlation between an applicant's race and their extracurricular achievement. The other thing, I think, is that Asian American students and applicants are perceived differently, and I think there's a lot of implicit bias going on there. It's not overt prejudice, it's not certainly hatred of Asian Americans, but it's an implicit bias. So that when a student happens to be, you know, earnest and want to go into medicine, and his name is John Smith, I think Harvard thinks, oh great, we need some people who are earnest and want to go into medicine. And when that student happens to be called John Lee, I think there's a whole set of assumptions and prejudices that go in, and in the end, a Harvard admissions officer might write, as we did on the file of one Asian American applicant, he's serious and, of course, wants to be a doctor. What's wrong about that? That when you're an Asian American, I think that ends up hurting your application, and that's part of the injustice that's going on.
And Yascha, where do you think this will all go?
Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly Asian Americans face discrimination, not just at college, but probably also at the level of job applications and so on. Here's what I want to say, which is that all kinds of criteria are acceptable, right? I don't know what makes for a perfect admission system. I don't know what makes for a perfect employee. But the one thing that's not acceptable is for somebody not to get into college, not to be hired for a job, just for the simple fact that they happen to be one race rather than another.
Yascha Mounk, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on.